February 16, 1943. Hardangervidda Plateau, Telemark, occupied Norway. A moonless wind swept across the frozen plateau, scouring the snow into thin white ribbons that hissed past the dark shapes trudging through the drifts. 6 men in tattered white camouflage, their skis creaking softly, their breath fogging into the sub-zero air as they hauled supply sleds across one of the most brutal winter landscapes in Europe. Above them, the sky was a hard, starless void. Below them was nothing but ice, rock, and the knowledge that one wrong step could send a concealed German patrol erupting out of the dark. Operation Gunnerside had no room for mistakes. The men, Joachim Runneberg's hand-picked sabotage team, moved silently, their rifles wrapped in cloth to dampen noise, the cold so penetrating it seemed to vibrate through bone. For 9 days they had crossed the Hardangervidda, living on frozen ration crumbs and snow melted over tiny spirit burners. Their objective lay miles ahead, buried deep within the Vemork industrial complex, the Norsk Hydro Heavy Water Plant, a facility protected by floodlights, armed guards, minefields, and winter cliffs sheer enough to shred rope. Inside its reinforced chambers, the Germans were producing deuterium oxide, heavy water, vital for their nuclear reactor experiments. Destroying it would not win the war overnight, but allowing it to continue could doom every Allied city within reach of a future German atomic weapon. The stakes had never been higher. At the head of the line, Runneberg stopped and raised a gloved fist. The others froze instantly. From the valley below came a distant mechanical rumble, muted by snowfall but unmistakable. A German supply truck convoy grinding along the only accessible road to Vemork. The men sank low into the snow, skis flat, bodies pressed into the white as the wind carried the faint clatter of engines and chains. They held their breath until the sound faded back into the storm. Only then did Runneberg motion forward. The team continued, descending slowly into a shallow depression that offered momentary shelter from the wind. In the dim light, their frostbitten faces looked ghost-like, illuminated only by the faint glow of the aurora hidden behind the clouds. Lieutenant Casper Idland checked his map with trembling hands. The coordinates were drawn carefully from intelligence gathered by the earlier failed British attempt, Operation Freshman, whose glider troops had crashed in the darkness months earlier. Many killed on impact, the survivors tortured and executed under Hitler's commando order. The land itself held the memory of failure. The burden weighed heavily on the team. They were not simply here to complete a mission, they were here to redeem the men who had died trying. Runneberg tucked the map away and surveyed the landscape. Somewhere out beyond the ridge lay the sheer gorge the Norwegians called Nazi-occupied, a black, frozen canyon hundreds of feet deep, carved by the icy river below. The only way to reach the heavy water plant undetected was to descend the gorge, cross the river, and climb the opposite side under the cover of darkness. The Germans believed the gorge was impassable in winter. That belief was the team's only advantage. A faint crack echoed through the night, ice settling, shifting. The men stiffened. For a moment, no one breathed. Then another sound emerged, softer, irregular, a rhythmic tapping. Idland raised his rifle. Runneberg shook his head. "Not Germans," he whispered. "Listen." The tapping grew slightly clearer, metal clicking against something hard. Then a faint, muffled shout. Runneberg's eyes widened. Ahead, on the wind-scoured slope, 2 dark shapes appeared, figures stumbling toward them, almost consumed by frost and exhaustion. The advance team, the Grouse unit, 4 Norwegian commandos who had been hiding on the plateau for weeks, living in an abandoned hunter's cabin, starving after repeated supply drops had failed. Runneberg waved urgently, and the 2 surviving Grouse men collapsed beside them, their faces gaunt, their movements slow and disjointed. One of them, Arne Kelstrup, managed a cracked whisper. "Germans increased patrols. Parachute canister spotted. They may know someone is here." Silence fell. Even the wind seemed to pause. If the Germans suspected commandos on the plateau, the entire sabotage plan could collapse before they ever reached the plant. Runneberg crouched beside Kelstrup, checking his frostbitten hands, listening to the fragmented details. A German ski patrol had appeared near the cabin 2 days ago. Fresh tracks were spotted. The enemy was active, alert, searching. Yet they hadn't located the Grouse camp or intercepted any radio transmissions, which meant the operation wasn't compromised yet. Runneberg looked out toward the black horizon where the heavy water plant stood hidden behind cliffs and snow and barbed wire. The wind howled again, harsher this time, dragging snow across their boots. The mission clock was shrinking. They had to move, tonight. But as the team prepared to resume their trek, a new sound drifted across the plateau. Low, distant, and unlike anything they had heard before. A mechanical hum, rhythmic and steady, coming from the direction of Vemork. Idland frowned and raised his binoculars, though the storm masked everything beyond a few hundred meters. "That's not a truck," he muttered. "Not an engine either," Halvard Haugland added. Runneberg felt a chill deeper than the cold. The Germans were working through the night. Something at the plant was being powered up, or moved, or tested. Something significant enough to break routine. Something urgent. And if it was related to heavy water production, the team was running out of time faster than command ever calculated. Runneberg tightened the strap on his pack, snow whipping at his face, and he said quietly, "We go. Now. Before whatever that is becomes something we cannot stop." The men rose, securing rifles, adjusting sleds, tightening frost-stiffened ropes. As they pushed onward into the darkness, the strange hum faded behind them, but its echo lingered like a warning. A warning that the Germans were preparing for something. A warning that Operation Gunnerside would not be the infiltration they had planned, but a race against an unseen deadline. And somewhere in the blackened valleys below, beneath the layers of snow and concrete, the heavy water plant continued to pulse with quiet, ominous life, awaiting the men who had come across a frozen wasteland to destroy it. February 27th, 1943. Vemork Gorge, Telemark, occupied Norway. 0219 hours. Snow drifted like slow-moving smoke across the moonlit cliffs as the sabotage team crawled on their bellies toward the edge of the canyon, their white suits blending seamlessly into the frozen landscape, while the roar of the Mona River rose faintly from the unseen depths below. The gorge lay before them like a black wound carved into the earth, its walls sheer, jagged, and coated in ice so smooth it reflected the moonlight like dull metal. Joachim Rundberg lay flat against the snow, binoculars pressed to his frostbitten face, studying the distant heavy water plant perched on the opposite cliff, its floodlights slicing through the darkness in rigid arcs, machine gun nests silhouetted on elevated platforms, and German guards pacing behind barbed wire fencing that curled like black thorns around the building. The entire complex hummed with a low mechanical vibration, a steady throb that seemed amplified by the cold night air. The turbines and electrolysis chambers deep inside working relentlessly to produce deuterium oxide for Germany's nuclear ambitions. The route to the plant's basement, a single narrow railway bridge, was too heavily defended to approach. Searchlights swept the valley floor with a cold, clinical precision, and dogs patrolled the perimeter with taut leashes. Any attempt to cross that bridge would be suicide. Their only option remained the route the Germans believed impossible, the frozen gorge. Rundberg signaled silently and began the descent first, plunging his ice axe into the brittle crust, feeling the cliff stone shudder beneath the strike. One by one, the team followed, lowering themselves inch by inch down the vertical drop, rope scraping against rock, snow flaking away in whispers as their boots sought purchase on patches of ice and stone no wider than fingertips. Frost stung their faces, rope burned their palms through the gloves. The canyon swallowed sound, replacing it with the relentless churn of the river far below. Halfway down, Haugland slipped. His crampon skidded off a patch of blue ice, his body jerking outward over the gorge. But Knut Hauklid lunged instantly, slamming his axe into the rock and gripping the rope, stopping the fall with a grunt of pain that echoed faintly into the darkness. No one spoke. No one needed to. They tightened their rigging and pressed on, breaths slow and shallow. After 40 agonizing minutes, they reached the riverbank, a narrow ice-slick strip beside the roaring water. The cold here was different, sharp and biting, as if the river exhaled frost instead of mist. They crossed quickly, leaping from rock to rock, moving under the cover of shadow until they reached the opposite cliff. The climb up was even worse. The slope was steeper, the ice thinner, the exposure total. One slip would send any one of them tumbling into the freezing river to vanish beneath the rapids forever. But the men moved with steady, practiced precision, climbing, anchoring, breathing through their fear, until at last their gloved hands gripped the ledge beneath the plant's retaining wall. Rundbark hauled himself over and signaled the others to do the same, the men collapsing silently behind a stack of supply crates half buried in snow. Above them, the plant loomed, its concrete exterior glowing faintly under floodlights, steam rising in pale tendrils from vents along the roof. The smell of chemicals carried faintly on the wind. Rundberg motioned for the team to advance. They crept along the outskirts of the facility, hugging the shadows, avoiding the main guard paths. The intelligence they carried, blueprints smuggled out by Norwegian resistance members, showed a weakness. A single unguarded cable tunnel running from the main building to a lower annex. If they could reach it, they could bypass the guards entirely. The tunnel entrance was a small metal hatch half buried under snow. Idland brushed the frost aside with gloved fingers, revealing the hinges. "Locked," he whispered, after testing it. Rundberg took out a pair of padded pliers, no metallic noise allowed, and began working the mechanism, steady hands betraying none of the tension thrumming through his body. After several minutes, the lock gave with a faint click. The men froze. A guard turned his head toward the sound, pausing for an agonizing heartbeat, then resumed his patrol. Rundberg exhaled slowly. They slipped into the tunnel one by one, the cramped metal shaft forcing them to crawl on elbows and knees through the freezing darkness. Their breaths echoed off the narrow walls. Their gear scraped softly against the steel. The passage smelled of oil, rubber, and the faint ozone scent of electrical circuits. After several minutes of crawling, the faint hum of machinery grew louder. A pale light glimmered ahead. They reached the end of the tunnel, a grated opening overlooking the basement of the electrolysis building. Through the grate they saw it. Rows of thick-walled cylinders, pipes and cables coiling like veins across the room, pressure gauges flickering under dim lamps. The heavy water chambers, the heart of the German nuclear program, and only one door led into the room, guarded by one man seated on a stool, rifle across his lap, head drooping with fatigue. Rundberg's team exchanged glances. This guard was the last obstacle. Rundberg signaled. Hauklid slipped out of the grate silently, landing behind machinery. He crept forward. A single gloved hand clamped over the guard's mouth. The man struggled once, briefly, then slumped unconscious as Hauklid eased him to the ground. The saboteurs poured into the room. Their breath fogged in the chemical-laden air as they moved quickly, methodically, guided by the memories of sabotage drills repeated endlessly in frozen shelters on the plateau. Explosive charges were unpacked. Small, specially designed units with slow fuses meant to destroy the electrolysis cells without setting off a catastrophic blast. Idland positioned one charge against the main manifold, wiping away frost to ensure proper adhesion. Haugland set another along the primary pipeline. Rundberg placed the last 2 charges at the heart of the cell chamber, hands steady despite the adrenaline hammering in his chest. Then they heard it. Footsteps above, heavy ones, boots moving quickly across a metal walkway, a muffled conversation in German. Rundberg raised a finger to his lips. The team froze. Then the footsteps stopped. Silence hung heavy. One of the Germans coughed. Another muttered something about a malfunctioning gauge. Then more steps, but moving away this time. Rundberg breathed again. He lit the fuse, its faint ember glowing like a dying star. They had 60 seconds, no more. The men slipped into the tunnel as quickly as they had come, crawling backward into darkness while the ember shrank behind them. The hum of the plant machinery seemed louder now, as if the building itself sensed its approaching fate. They reached the exterior hatch, shoved it open, and spilled into the freezing night air. Rundberg signaled and the team sprinted, skis tucked under their arms, toward the gorge edge. Behind them, a faint thump echoed across the cliffs. Then a second, then a rolling metallic roar as the heart of the heavy water plant trembled under its own destruction. Steam burst from the vents, lights flickered, alarms blared echoing across the valley, shouts erupted from German guards. But by the time the first searchlights swept the gorge, the saboteurs were already gone, vanishing into the frozen wilderness like ghosts swallowed by the Norwegian winter. They had succeeded. Yet as the wind howled and snow swallowed their tracks, Rundberg felt an unease beneath the triumph. The mission was only half finished. The Germans would repair the damage quickly. They always did. And somewhere in the distance, far down the valley, a deeper rumble began to rise. Something he had not expected. Something that meant the enemy was not reacting blindly. They were preparing for pursuit, an intense one. And the saboteurs, burdened with no safe shelter and hunted across the unforgiving plateau, would now face a new test: survival. February 28, 1943. Hardangervidda Plateau, Telemark, 0411 hours. The night exploded behind them in a distant bloom of steam and shattered metal, the echo rolling across the frozen uplands like slow thunder as Joachim Renneberg and his team skied hard into the dark wilderness, their breath tearing from their lungs in ragged clouds, while the glow of the sabotaged heavy water plant pulsed faintly behind the mountains. The wind sliced across the plateau in vicious gusts, stinging their faces with needles of ice as snow swirled blindly around them. No one spoke. Every man understood what the explosion meant and what would follow. The Germans knew. The search would begin instantly. Floodlights would be sweeping the factory ruins already, dogs unleashed, patrols mobilizing, officers shouting over the alarms as radio messages hammered back and forth between Vemork, Rjukan, and Gestapo headquarters in Oslo. And somewhere down in that valley, the wrecked electrolysis chambers were still hissing and groaning as superheated pipes split apart, spilling the last of the precious heavy water the Germans had fought so desperately to protect. The mission was a success, but survival was now the mission. The saboteurs pushed onward across the plateau, skis whispering along frozen crust as they angled north toward a prearranged rendezvous cabin hidden miles away. Their legs burned, their fingers were numb blocks inside frozen gloves. But behind them came a new sound, faint at first, almost drowned by the wind. Engines. Motorized sleds. German Schnellkettenfahrzeuge, moving fast. Haugland shot a glance over his shoulder, eyes narrowing. They're closer than they should be. Renneberg didn't need confirming. The pursuit had begun far sooner than expected. They must have seen something, Idland said quietly. Tracks near the cable tunnel, patrol reports, something. Renneberg shook his head. It doesn't matter how. We move. But the truth dug deep in his mind. The strange mechanical hum they'd heard the night before, the increased guard rotations, the hurried activity inside the plant. The Germans had been preparing for something. Maybe not sabotage, but disruption. They had been on edge, ready to react, and now that readiness was bearing down on the plateau behind them. The wind strengthened, pushing sharp, swirling sheets of snow into their faces. The men lowered their heads and powered forward. Then Idland raised a fist. "Halt!" They dropped instantly into the snow. Far behind them, through the storm, a faint glow drifted across the darkness, sweeping arcs of light, searchlights, mounted on tracked vehicles. The Germans were not simply following tracks, they were scanning the plateau itself, sweeping the endless white for movement. "We can't outrun them in the open," Haugland whispered. "But we don't need to outrun them," Renneberg replied. "We just need to outlast them." He pointed toward a jagged rise ahead, a stretch of broken terrain, ridges and boulders half buried in snow, wind-carved drifts deep enough to swallow a man whole. The kind of terrain no tracked vehicle could cross without risking a breakdown or a broken axle. Perfect cover for ghosts on skis. They veered toward it. Moments later, gunshots cracked across the plateau, the sharp clang of Mauser rifles firing blindly into the storm. Snow puffed into the air around them as bullets hit the crust far behind, the Germans firing at shadows, illusions, anything that moved. Renneberg forced the pace harder. The team wove into the broken terrain, skis dancing between rocks and narrow cuts in the snow, breath ripping through their chests. Behind them, the engine noise grew louder, closer, then abruptly stopped. The Germans had reached the rocks. The engine sputtered, reversed, struggled. Then a frustrated shout echoed faintly across the wind. The terrain was stopping them. "They'll send patrols on foot," Haugland murmured. "Yes," Renneberg replied, "but they'll be slower than we are." And then came a new sound, one that froze the team's blood more completely than the wind ever could. Barking. Barking that carried across the plateau with eerie clarity. Dogs. Trained winter pursuit dogs. Renneberg's jaw clenched. "We need to split." "No," Haugland snapped. "We stay together. If they follow all our tracks, they'll catch us. If we split, they can't follow all three directions." The team exchanged looks. Fear, defiance, trust. Then, slowly, nodded. Renneberg pointed to two valleys splitting off from the main plateau. "Idland, Haugland, you take the eastern ridge. Haugland, you take the western drift line. I'll continue north." No last words, no farewells, just a firm handshake from each man as they separated into three silent lines, vanishing into the swirling dark like white phantoms. Renneberg's skis carved through the snow, every muscle screaming as he pushed himself harder than he ever had in his life. Behind him, the barking grew faint, then moved sideways, splitting along two trails. Good, good, keep moving. He climbed a narrow ridge, the wind knifing across his face, snow whipping so fiercely he could barely see his own skis. He pressed forward. Minutes passed, then an hour, then the barking faded entirely. The wind swallowed everything. Silence returned. But the danger did not. The wind eased, revealing a faint orange glow on the horizon, dawn approaching. Dawn meant visibility. Visibility meant death. Renneberg angled toward a rocky outcrop and collapsed behind it, chest heaving, breath fogging in great heaving clouds. He forced himself to keep listening. Nothing but wind, nothing but his own pulse. Slowly, painfully, the darkness lifted and the first pale blue light spread across the plateau. Snowfields shimmered like sheets of cold glass. The pursuit was gone, vanished into the night behind him. But they would return. They would search. They would comb every inch of Telemark to find the saboteurs responsible for crippling the heavy water plant. Renneberg rose again. There was still a long journey to cross. Days of skiing, hunger, frost, and uncertainty before he reached the next safe house, and beyond that the long path to Sweden. But as he stepped back into the endless white, something inside him shifted. The Germans could rebuild the plant, yes, and he knew they would try, but they could never rebuild what they lost tonight. Time. Critical months. Months the Allies desperately needed. And that was the true victory. Still, as he crossed the plateau, the image stayed with him. The dogs, the searchlights, the strange mechanical hum beneath the plant the night before. Something had been happening in Vemork, something beyond the routine production of heavy water, something the Germans were accelerating. And Operation Gunnerside, though successful, had only paused it. A pause was not an end. As the wind howled again and swallowed his figure into the frozen expanse, Renneberg knew this: the war for atomic power had not been won on this plateau tonight. It had merely begun.